are live, so let me transition you over.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Public Brain Trust. My name is Javi, and today I'll be talking to you about web services. What are they? Why should we use them? Join me in a quick discussion today where we go over these topics and explore this knowledge. This is today's agenda. Today we'll be exploring a couple of things. First, we'll be exploring what a web service is. Next, we'll be talking about why you should use web services and how it can help you streamline your development and prototyping. After that, we'll have a quick code along where we'll create a web service of our own. And then after that, we'll take a look at a demo that I've built out for you guys to kind of demonstrate how web services can help empower your development. Following that, we'll have a quick Q&A session where we'll open the floor up for questions and have a discussion so we can all learn together. All right, let's dive right in. So first off, what is a web service? We hear this term thrown around left and right, especially in the IT world. But a lot of times it's confusing because it's used in many different contexts. In reality, a web service can be a number of things. But at its simplest core, a web service is any piece of arbitrary software that's made available through the network, such as HTTP. Web services can be language agnostic, so they're not specifically tied to one specific language. If you code in Python, you can write web services. If you code in C, you can write web services. Any programming language of your choice. My personal preference is JavaScript. They can be internal, within your internal network, to help you prototype applications or reach resources within your network easily and interface with data. Or they can be available through the internet, allowing you to grab that same data and resources over the internet from anywhere you are. Typically, web services come in two flavors, SOAP and REST. Today, we'll be talking about REST, which is representative state transfer. Let's take a look at a quick quote from IBM. I feel like this is a really great quote to kind of embody what a web service is in one short phrase. A web service is a generic term for an interoperable machine-to-machine software function that is hosted at a network address location. That's just a fancy way of saying it's a piece of software that you can access from anywhere, and it can facilitate machine-to-machine communication. So now, why would we use a web service? We know what it is, but how does it help us, right? Web services help us share functionality easily. That's the biggest way that I implement web services in my code, is whenever I have something that I want to code that I know that I'm going to need in one or more other applications, I can create a web service out of this functionality, sharing that functionality easily between my multiple applications. We can also use them to expose custom, which means applications and packages that you built, or third-party libraries and packages, such as packages available through NPM or Composer. They also help facilitate communication between multiple different applications. In today's world, there are many different technologies and a couple of different stacks for you to choose from when you're building out your application. Some people choose to code in Python, where they'll use Django as their backend. Some other people, like myself, prefer JavaScript and use a Node.js runtime, right? So how do you get these two applications to talk to each other? What if the Node.js application needs some data or functionality from the Django side? Well, that's where a web service can help you. A web service can act as a middleman, connecting both of those pieces together, allowing you to share that data and build a pipeline. Furthermore, web services help us make our application code a lot more modular. And because they're modular, meaning that we're taking a specific functionality and separating it out on its own, it becomes easier to scale. You can easily launch more instances of your web service to handle more traffic and set up some type of load balancing. So how do we use them here at Harmonic? Well, at Harmonic, we have a vast library of internal web services that we use often. What we do is we deploy internal RESTful web services for any code or functionality that we want to be able to use on multiple tech stacks. We use our internal web services to prototype out applications very quickly. This way, we don't have to worry about implementing logic that we've already implemented elsewhere over and over again. We can save that time and just simply send an HTTP request to interface with that same data. We also use web services to integrate to FileMaker, to our FileMaker solutions, to help expand the capabilities of our FileMaker solutions. FileMaker is an excellent software and provides us with many tools and functionality. However, there are some ways in which FileMaker is limited, and what web services can do is allow you to use those third-party packages from NPM, from Composer, from pip, and reach those functionalities provided by those packages via HTTP, directly from an insert from URL script step. So now, with all that being said, now that we have a pretty good understanding of what a web service is, let's go ahead and build one ourselves. Today, we'll be building a web service that helps us format and convert timestamps. When I say convert timestamps, what I mean is taking a timestamp from perhaps one time zone and converting it to another. Oftentimes, what you'll find is many databases and services rely on UTC-based timestamps because it's generally best practice. And what a web service can help us do is easily convert between times. Maybe we need to format it in specific ways. For example, FileMaker only accepts a specific format for date times. And it's not the only software. There are many out there. And what this web service will help you do is not only format the time, but also convert it so it's in the correct time zone no matter where you are. For our code along today, we'll be building a Node.js application. We'll be using the Express Web Framework. And what this will do is help us build a web application very easily with minimal code. And then we'll be using Moment.js, which is a popular time manipulation package available through NPM. So let's go ahead and code. All right. So the first thing we're going to want to do is set up a directory for our new service. In this case, I'm calling it Datetime API. I'm going to open it up in Visual Studio Code. What we're going to need to do first is create a package.json file. This file essentially holds metadata and information about our new package that we're building, or our new application. It also helps us manage the dependencies. We're going to use yarn init to create that package.json file that'll hold all of our dependencies. Now that we've run that and filled out the quick form, we now have our package.json. You can see it's right there. Very pretty. We're going to want to next install all of our dependencies. In this case, it's very simple. We're just using cores, Express, and Moment.js. We'll be using the Moment time zone variant of that Moment.js package because that's the package that'll allow us to manipulate between time zones as well. So if we take a look here, now that we've got our dependencies, the next thing we need is the root of our application. And our application will start off at this index.js file. The first thing we'll do is import Express, our dependency. And then we're going to go ahead and create an app from using that Express. We'll invoke the Express function, which will return to us a web framework application. We're going to next import cores so that we can use cross-origin resource sharing. So that means that you can use this web service in a more flexible way within your network. The next two lines here are going to be basic boilerplate. The first one there is just telling Express that we want to communicate using JavaScript. The next one is telling Express that, hey, we might have some fancy URLs that have some special characters. So we want to use URL encoding so that it can pick up those fancy characters and encode them correctly. And now the last thing we want to do is be able to listen, right? What good's a web application if it doesn't listen for our requests? It won't be able to do anything for us. Before that, we want to specify which port we want to listen to. And what we'll do is, by default, we'll look for that port in our environment variables using process.env port. And if that doesn't exist, we're going to, if that doesn't exist, what we'll do is we'll listen on port 8463. All right, once our application is listening, it's going to log out to the console that it is listening at the specified port that we designated. Now let's create some routes, right? We have our application framework set up. We have the backbone of our web service. Now we want to create routes so that we can direct traffic to a specific route and have it perform some functionality and return a response to us. Again, we're going to import our Express app there, and we're going to create a router by invoking express.router. Once we do that, we want to make sure that we're exporting this router so that it's available in other files, and you'll see why that's important in a bit. And then we're going to go ahead and start creating our routes. So the first one you'll notice here is a post route, and that's going to go to a route ending in /2UTC. It's going to take a request and a response, and it's going to execute the code block that's specified there. We want to check to make sure our user has sent us valid information. For our request, we're going to look for a field in the JSON body of our request that's called date time. And if that doesn't exist, we know our user has not passed us valid requests. So what we want to do is let them know right away that, hey, this is no good. Maybe you need to tweak this just a little bit and try again. Once we have a valid request body object, we can take that datetime object and we can use the JavaScript datetime object to parse that into a JavaScript datetime object. And now some of you might be wondering, those of you that are more familiar with JavaScript, why not just use moments datetime parsing? Well, to put it simply, moment is deprecating a lot of formats for datetime strings. And what we want to do is be able to have have multiple string formats and the JavaScript pick it up and be able to parse that date out correctly. Typically, the JavaScript date object does a way better job at that currently, and it's not going to be deprecating any of the formats anytime soon. So it's a better long-term solution. All right. Once we have our datetime object, we want to call the moment.utc and pass in that datetime object. And what that'll do for us is create a new datetime object using moment that'll have converted that date timestamp into UTC format. Once we have that, we can send it back to our user, and that's all we need to do. Our user will have that new date time. So to test this out, we're going to install a Dev Dependency. This one's called NodeMon. What NodeMon does is NodeMon allows us to easily restart our server every time we hit the save button. So it'll be watching for any changes in our files and automatically trigger a restart. This way, it saves us some time for having to close the server and restart it. All right, now that we've got our server listening, you can see down there that it's listening at port 8463. We're going to go ahead and test this out. So this specific web service is running on my own machine, so it's at localhost, and we'll be using Postman to go ahead and drive that traffic. Postman is just a simple tool that helps us make HTTP requests and visualize what that request body is going to look like, both when we're sending it and when we're receiving a response. So again, we're going to send that to /datetime/UTC, which is our endpoint. All right, so let's pass in a date here. And so now that we've sent out our request, we've gotten back our date time. And if you notice, the datetime string has been printed to the console here because we put that in our request. That was one of the steps there. And you can see that that's the datetime before it was converted. And this is the datetime after it was converted. So we can see that the time is shifted to reflect UTC time. But what if we have an invalid date? What if our user passes us some date that's invalid, and they're relying on that response datetime field, right? It'll pass back null, and there might be some cases where that's an issue. So what we want to do is let the user know that, hey, this is an invalid date. What we'll do is we'll check by using the toString method on our date object, and it'll return to us what that date string should look like. If it is null, then we'll get a not valid string back, and we want to pass that on to our user. Here you'll see I'm going to fast forward through a couple of more of these routes. I'm just building out a few basic routes that we use often here at Harmonic. Some things, like I mentioned before, converting time to FileMaker format, converting time to MySQL format, and the last one that you'll notice there is converting time to a different time zone. All of this code will be available to you at the end of the session, and you can look at the link description below to find out where that code is available. So we're just testing out our routes to just make sure that they all work, right? Always good measure, right? We want to make sure that we're not just building something that doesn't work. Cool. So now that we've created our web application, right? We've created our first web service, and it's going to help us in our next portion, which is going to be our demo. So for this demo, what I've done is I've created a new FileMaker solution, and it's creatively named La Bibliothèque. Pause for the laughs. So what this application does, let's just imagine for a second that we have some service out there, some company out there that has a library of books. And in this case, they're only tech books. Why only tech books, you ask? Because it's the data set that I was able to get. And so they have this distributed system that relies on this book data, which is stored in MongoDB, right? They have multiple different applications accessing this data from, let's say, a mobile device, a web application, right? And now they want to be able to create a FileMaker solution to help them keep track of when people are borrowing books and when they're returning them and when they're due. So let's take a look at our demo application. I'm just going to slide over here. I've already got it open for you guys. So this is La Bibliothèque, our amazing library borrowing app. So you'll see here on the left-hand side, we have a card. And what this card does is it displays not only the book image, but some data about the book itself. Now, some of you FileMaker enthusiasts out there may be wondering, so you're opening an ESS connection? How do you do that with MongoDB? Well, there are ways. It's a little bit more difficult, but no. We are not replicating data from MongoDB. We're not connecting through ESS. What we're doing is we're using global fields to just store this data once we've queried it. So under the hood, what's happening here, let's take a look at the scripts that power this baby up. So you'll notice on the left-hand side, there are these two searchable fields. And so the first one is for the book ID, and the second one is for the book name, right? So we have two scripts that'll help us get a book by ID or get a book by name. What they do essentially is they take in your book name from this global field or your book ID from this global field, and they insert it into a curl request that we're sending off to one of our web services. Here you'll see that the API URL I'm using is the one where I'm hosting the service that connects us to MongoDB. Next, we'll set some options that'll insert our data in, and it will put in our curl options specifying a post request. Before we do that, however, we need to create our request body object. For that, we're using this JSON set element step. And what that does is it just creates a JSON object with a field that has ID, which is the field that our web service will be looking for. And it'll put in that book's ID from that global field that we have. And it'll send it as a JSON string. Now that we have our data, we can plug all of those pieces into our insert from URL script step, and that should send off an HTTP request to our MongoDB service, which will reach out to our MongoDB database and retrieve the book information. Now that we've got our information back in our response, we want to make sure that it's valid. So we'll check the status response, and that's just the status field in that response JSON object. And we'll check for a code of 200, which specifies an HTTP success. Next, we want to check that we actually received some data back, right? Because the way the MongoDB web service works is it's using Mongoose on the back end, and when you send a request, a valid request, and there are no results, you'll just receive an empty array back. And we want to make sure that we have some data in our array, that we're getting back a book. Once we have our book, we know it exists, we've gotten it back from MongoDB, we want to put that into FileMaker in some way. So we're going to perform this script here. And what this script does is it sets the book data. Very, very simple. Intuitive naming, really. So let's take a look at that script. So you'll see what it does first is it sets a variable called book. It grabs this from the script parameter, which we're passing in from one of these scripts here. And once we've got our book data in our script parameter, we want to parse out the fields from that JSON object. And we want to set them into our variables here. Sorry, our global fields. The only one problem is that MongoDB returns to us a date object that is not in FileMaker format. It uses your typical date-time string format, which is just not compatible with FileMaker. So before we do anything and display that date, we want to make sure that the date is properly formatted. And the field that has the wrongly formatted date is the published date. So we want to make sure that our users can see that, because that can be important in some instances. So what we'll do now is we'll run another script. And this script will convert our date time to FileMaker format. Now, most of you might be wondering, how does a web service come into this? right? Well, we're going to use that web service that we just built shortly a few moments ago. We'll use that web service to send in this wrongly formatted datetime object or datetime string, and it'll format us the string into FileMaker format and send it back to us as a string, which we can then apply. So you'll see here, the API URL in this case will be a little bit different. You'll notice that the port has changed, and so has the endpoint. So this is targeting that datetime web service, and we want to call the to FileMaker route, which will take that datetime again and convert it into the proper format. Again, we want to create our request body, and if you remember from the demo, our request body was very simple, just had one field called datetime. And so that's what we're doing here. We're just going to go ahead and build out that object here, and we'll have a field called datetime, and we're going to take the script parameter, which again, we passed in the timestamp from our previous script. And so we're going to grab that and put it into our JSON object. Now that we've got our JSON object, we can go ahead and again add in our options to our curl request and send that off via the insert from URL script step. Awesome. Now we've got our datetime and it's been converted properly. What we're going to do next is we're going to exit out this script and return it back to the script that was calling it. In this case, that being the set book data. Great. So now we have our formatted publish date, and we're going to go ahead and set that in by getting it from the script results of the prior script, and we're going to set the rest of our fields accordingly. All right, so let's watch it in action now. This is the fun part. All righty. So what we'll do here is we'll just search up a random book ID. We'll start by using a book ID. And in this case, we'll just use book ID 42. Once we go ahead and search that, you'll see instantaneously our book data has arrived, and we can see it there, including a thumbnail. And for those of you that are wondering, we're displaying that thumbnail using a web viewer. We have a global field that's hidden right now, but what that global field holds is the URL to where that image is stored, and that's coming from the database. Once we set that field, we can update our web viewer, and it'll reflect that image that it's grabbed from wherever that image is. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to say, hey, John Doe wants to borrow this book, iPhones in Action. He's already borrowed it, might have lost it, we don't know. So if we go ahead and click borrow here, what it's doing is it's just grabbing the data from those global fields and creating a new record in the context of this portal here, which is under borrowed, the borrowed table. And the borrowed table is a join table. It acts as a join table. What it does is it grabs the data from the book, global fields, and grabs the data from our users table and creates a new record, and then we're able to view it through the members layout here, which will combine the both. All right, so there's our demo. Hope you guys enjoyed it. The next thing I want to show you guys real quick here is a quick recap summary. Now, I know this was a lot of information, and there may still be some questions. So I hope you were able to absorb as much as possible. If not, here are some quick keynote points that'll help you understand a little bit easier, right? Very simple. What is a web service? How can they help us? All righty. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I really do. Now we're going to take this time to open up the floor for some questions. Do we have any questions?
I have one question.
You, sir. There in the back.
Wait, before we go there, we do have microphone-age.
Okay, so my question is, obviously for some more complex processing that would be happening, a web service from a performance standpoint makes sense. But for something as simple as like convert this date format, what's the performance difference between calling the web service through the insert from URL, letting that machine do its thing and send back the response, versus just doing that calculation locally, either from FileMaker or from JavaScript or wherever else the client is? Well, what's the performance difference between those two for something simple?
For something simple like that, there really wouldn't be a huge noticeable performance difference, and that's actually a really great question. Where web services can help in this instance is, let's say you have another application that you need to implement the same logic, you wouldn't have to recode it. And for a solution like a FileMaker solution, running a script can, well, obviously adds on extra compute time on your FileMaker client, right? So we can avoid that computation by replacing it with one simple step, which is insert from URL, which on the long run is one script step versus multiple script steps, making it a lot faster, more efficient. Anybody else?
Anybody else with questions?
Off the top of your head.
Wait. Hold it up closer to your...
Top of your head, Javi. Can you give us a couple more simple examples that we would use a web service for things we might do commonly?
Yes, that's a really great question as well. So oftentimes we need to interface with databases, right? Being that we're a FileMaker centric company, we use databases a lot, and we really value the way that data is stored and how we're able to retrieve it, right? With a web service, you can grab data from many different types of databases by launching a web service specific to that database. And so all of your applications, not only your FileMaker solution, but your web solution or your mobile apps, can then target that data from that database easily through that web service. All right, we got another question here.
Actually, I have a response to what Heather said. I think another use case that I've seen, I haven't personally used, but that I've seen for web services is if you're integrating with some API that requires certain cryptographic signatures in the authorization process. Some of those FileMaker doesn't have the native functions to do. Right. And so if you just build out a simple web service that you pass in whatever you need and it will create that signature for you and then send that back. Obviously, you have to make sure that that's on a local network and encrypted in things, because the whole point of the cryptographic signature is that it's encrypted. So you wouldn't want to be sending that over a public connection, but something like that to where you could use that with across different applications and implementations. So you go, okay, I need to do a SHA-1 HMAC signature. Okay, well, there's the web service for that, regardless of what API you're actually trying to integrate with. You just have a web service that can write that particular signature. So, yeah.
All right, and for anybody who's, please hold on a moment. I'm sorry, people. Fred is live. For those people who are currently watching, if you have any questions, please use your live chat feature, and we will get them in.
I don't really have a question. I just kind of have a comment. The thing that I find appealing about this is that I know that we could write custom functions to go into systems to do some of the same type of things, but if we were to start a new solution, we would have to move those over. They may change. They may get updated. Our old files don't get updated. The thing I like about this is that there's one instance of this, just one instance of it that we can call from anywhere. And if there's ever updates or anything that need to get made to it, they're made to the original service, and all the files that depend on them get the benefits of those updates.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I really think this approach is really appealing, and I like looking forward to more.
Yeah, absolutely. Web services will help us take our logic and put them in one central place. So it's one place to maintain, one code base to maintain, and one central place to add or extend functionality. And once you extend it on your web service, it's available to all of the clients that rely on it. Any other questions? got it.
One of the things that you blew by pretty fast, I'm trying to keep up, but you talked originally about Moment.js, and then you referred to them deprecating certain functions. So, and so instead of using Moment.js, I think you were just using direct JavaScript or something to do the date-time conversions. Is that right?
So what I was doing is, so Moment is deprecating certain formats that it'll take to understand
Like
the date.
like IO formats.
Yes, like IO formats.
Okay.
And so they're deprecating certain formats, and the JavaScript datetime object doesn't. However, Moment still converts time a lot better and a lot easier. So we just use the JavaScript portion to parse this the string that we receive into an understandable JavaScript date object, and then we pass that into Moment to actually do the conversions.
Got it. So okay, so abstracting that a little bit further. Talk for a second about how do we strategically build custom web services using JavaScript and Node and so forth. So historically, just to rewind it back, 15 years ago, we started building web services way before anybody called them web services, using HTTP calls, and there wasn't an insert from URL at the time, so we were using import XML and different things like that, right? But it was fundamentally the same thing. It was let me push an electronic call out, do processing, and pull the result back. Originally, we would build that as a one-off. So I need to build a thing that parses a bunch of data, or I need to jam a bunch of data in, or flush a bunch of data out, or whatever it was, right? Then it was I need to interact with this service externally that uses some arcane API on their end, and I can't talk to that API directly from FileMaker, so let's build a widget in between, right? A web service, if you will. FileMaker's tool set now is, of course, much more robust for doing that talking and handling and interaction. But I think as we've been talking around, sometimes there are good reasons not to do it all natively within FileMaker. If I can just make a call to a lightweight little Node web service, that's nice. That's handy, right? But I think for me, the thing I struggle with as a user or a developer, or just even if I'm just kind of sitting in a consultative or architect role, is when do I make that ask, right? When do I say, hey, Hav, I need a 10-minute web service to do this thing, right? When do I know I should do a web service for that versus not, right? So, and I think it gets to questions like, hey, there's already this really solid JavaScript class that does this thing. Well, where's my list of that stuff, right? How do I know there's a class out there that already solves this and this and this problem that I can tap Hav on the shoulder for to build me a web service around, and it's going to cost me, or cost the client, an hour's billable time, right? Versus it's going to take me 4 hours, and I'm going to have a less scalable solution if I try to do it this other way that, I might be able to do myself. How do we start to get our hands around understanding what that list of things are, putting it in the should try, shouldn't try categories, right? And making those decisions. What are some thoughts about resources or lists of things or types of things? Give me a handle to start thinking about how we ask those questions.
I gotcha. That's actually a really great question. Like you said, sometimes it can be more beneficial to just hard code the functionality of whatever it is you're trying to do in your solution. A good way to think about when to use a web service is when you have a particular piece of your application that you're going to need maybe in another application or in a different part of this application, right? So once you're rewriting the same code twice, you automatically know that there could be a possible better way to do this, right? And that could be to centralize that functionality in one place using a web service. Now, to answer the second part of what functionality can that web service provide us, and what packages can we use, me as a JavaScript developer, I often look on the NPM registry, or I do a simple Google search a lot of times to just check the service that I need to use. And if
Like
there's a
JavaScript cat library
Yes.
mechanism, for instance, or something like that.
Kind of. For example, let's say like Docker, right? Docker is something that a lot of developers will use. So there's got to be a package that handles that. In this case, date times are something that are commonly used and manipulated. So we just search for Google, date time, JavaScript, and we can see a list of popular packages that are used and a couple of different examples from multiple people. And that's just JavaScript. When it comes to other languages such as Python, there's also a registry there for pip. And similarly for every language, there's some type of package manager where you can search and see if there's a package that someone already wrote that implements the functionality that you need. And so if you're writing the same code again, you can search on Google and say, hey, has someone already done this work? And you can take that logic and bundle it up into a web service and make it available.
Right. Okay. So Google's my friend.
Google's your friend.
To an extent, right? Because I can see, oh, here's this person talking about this or that person talking about that. And I can maybe evaluate, I'm talking about me now, I can maybe read that and evaluate, oh, this looks pretty legit. But then to kind of answer the next part of my question, how do I get my hands around what it's going to take to go from here's this thing I found on Google to all of that super fast typing we watched your movie do?
I want to know what's in his coffee in the morning.
Right? To testing the routes, I think was what you called it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So going through and testing all the different URL variations. To inserting it in, right? Is there a simple way to put a handle on, yeah, it's usually X to Y amount of effort, or does it just really depend on what it is we're trying to do and so forth?
So it's sort of the latter. It depends on what you're trying to do. And what I typically do is whenever I'm looking at some type of functionality that I want to make available, I'll look through the documentation of that package that I'm looking to use. And with a lot of the more popular things that people need to do on a regular basis, those packages that are used widely have pretty extensive documentation. So you can take a glance through the documentation to kind of understand what it would take to implement that logic and how long it would take versus actually coding it out in yourself, right? Then there comes the thought of, okay, so now that I've invested this time coding this out, right, within this specific application, if I need to use it somewhere else, there's going to be that same amount of time, or maybe slightly less, that I'm going to have to spend to re-implement that. So on the short term, in certain circumstances, you may end up spending a little bit more time developing your web service for some functionality or package that you want to expose. But in the long term, if you know it's something that you're going to reuse, you're saving that time because you're not having to implement that logic over and over again.
Okay, not quite the question I'm trying to ask, though. Okay. But I appreciate that. So let's say that I Google and I find that there's this super awesome JavaScript cat photo editor, right? And I love using cat photos. So for my social media posts, because you guys know what a social media hound I am. So I really want to automate the editing of my cat photos so I can just like spam the memes all the time, right? So I'm trying to get my hand around what's the level of effort to take this third-party JavaScript cat photo editor that's out there. It does everything I want it to do, but I'm just a FileMaker guy, so I'm trying to get my hand around what's that going to take. So if I go down and I tap you on the shoulder and convince you that you should, in fact, help me do this. You know, how much effort is it going to take to take this third-party thing, this JavaScript cat photo editor, and turn it into a widget that Steve can use to spam memes from FileMaker all day long, right? So what, setting aside whether you should help me do that.
Hey, I like cat images. I use it.
how do you so not the should we do it as a web service question, right? But the okay, I've decided I want to do it as a web service. What's it going to take to turn it into a web service? To take this third-party bit of JavaScript code and turn it into a web service, right? Is it a can we put a number on that kind of hello world moment of, hey, the first route works via Postman. It works, right? Is that a 10-minute exercise? Is it a 10-hour exercise? Does it just depend, and why? That's what I'm asking.
Gotcha. So it's, again, it goes back to the actual package that you're trying to use and what that logic looks like that you need to implement, and the learning curve that you're going to need to take to get from like, I don't know this package at all, to now I know what the methods are available in this package and what I'm going to use. As far as building out the web service itself, with the help of popular web application frameworks like Express, the actual coding portion of it is relatively quick, because if you remember from the demo, it was only maybe like 10 lines for that one that we coded together, right? For that one route we coded together, because the Express web application framework has abstracted away some of that hard work for us to be able to listen and respond to HTTP requests. So it's more about the package that you're trying to implement and how long it takes to kind of understand what that package does, how to use it, and what parameters it takes and what it's going to be returning to you.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, that varies between all the different web application frameworks you're going to use too, right? I use Express because it's the popular JavaScript one, and it's, again, very lightweight, very easy to code, relatively quick. But for someone that's used to programming in Python, they might choose to use Django or Flask, right? And those may have a little bit of a different learning curve. Those maybe it's a little bit more coding to actually implement the same logic. That, again, varies from web application framework to framework.
Cool.
All righty.
So as a FileMaker developer who has zero knowledge of the type of coding and magic that you showed us there, what would you estimate the learning curve to be for someone who has none of that knowledge, but only really wants to learn enough about that knowledge to be able to do what you described and what you demoed, creating web services that I can use from FileMaker specifically? So like you mentioned a couple of different apps for coding. I wouldn't even begin to know where to look to find those kinds of apps in the first place. So what would you estimate the learning curve would be to learn how to do this without having a hobby in my office?
First off, if you don't already have a hobby in your office, you need to get one. That's but to answer your question, Heather, learning a new language can seem like it's a little bit more complex than what it really is. There are some steep learning curves depending on what language you choose to use. JavaScript, in my opinion, is a language.
The easiest one.
Yeah, it's the easiest one that's, for me at least, it's the easiest one. And the learning curve is not really that much, especially if you're used to already coding using the Json functions in FileMaker. You essentially already are starting to dip into the world of JavaScript because you know what a JavaScript object is, right? What it looks like and how it's structured, right? And that's just one data type. There's just a few more data types, primitives, and coming from the FileMaker side, that's also something that is already ingrained in you on some level. You know what a string is, you know what numbers are, and those are your primitive data types. It's just syntax that you got to learn. It's like learning, it's quite literally like learning another language, like learning Spanish, right? Which has been pretty hard for me, but you know, JavaScript comes very easy now. Yeah, so it's that time between starting to learn a new language and learning it that can vary from person to person as well. It depends on how much effort you're putting into it, what language you chose, and how complex it is. Moving forward, one of the ideas that I was thinking of implementing here in our office is some quick JavaScript tutorials, right, from 0 to Pro. And that's something that you can look forward to in the future.
Okay, we are coming up on 45 minutes here, so if you all have any other questions you'd like to ask, it's a good time to close out.
Alrighty, guys. I want to thank you, everybody from home that's tuned in. I hope you all stay safe during these troubling times. And thank you, all of you guys here live with me. I appreciate your time and your questions today, and I hope that you've learned something about web services from my presentation.
And we want to thank you all for joining us today. This is Harmonic Software Production Studio monthly public brain trust. Have a great day.